we are jumping back into what I'm calling the answers around the three questions, and we saw the statement from Rabban Gamliel that you have to say these three things on Pesach, and if you don't say them, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. Pesach, matzah, and maror. Even though in our Haggadot now the order goes according to Pesach, matzah, and maror, finishing with maror. But in the older versions of the Mishnah, actually, when laying out the reasons, the last term was matzah. We end with matzah, and that's because matzah al shem shenigalu, because they were redeemed, which then, at least in the Mishnah, leads us to the praising of God for having redeemed us, and moving on to the discussion of Hallel, which has the blessing of redemption. So matzah is sort of like the food that leads us to redemption. What I wanted to look at with you today is how are we understanding matzah as a symbol at the Seder? Because at least according to Rabban Gamliel, the purpose of eating the matzah is to remind us that we were redeemed, even though we have other understandings of the word that seem to indicate that matzah is the opposite of redemption. In other words, is matzah is matzah sort of in this middle category? Is matzah in the category of maror? Maror embittered our lives, and matzah is also a representation of how our lives used to be thin and flat and lacking the ways in which we could live more fully, or is it on the side of Pesach? The Pesach is the symbol of God passing over our houses and saving us. So matzah is this sort of middle category, and as we're going to see in the Seder, it plays both of these roles, and we just want to sort of focus in and understand this tension. So Rabban Gamliel again would say, whoever hasn't said these three things, Pesach, matzah, maror, hasn't fulfilled their obligation. And then we read matzah al shum or al shem shenig alu. Matzah is because they were redeemed. And again, in the Mishnah originally, although we have an expanded version of that in our Haggadot, in the Mishnah there's no word play, as we said. Unlike Pesach, in which God passed over, unlike Maror, in which God embittered, or our lives were embittered by the Egyptians. Matzah, it's simply matzah equals geula. Matzah is, you're supposed to understand matzah as a direct connection to redemption. Of course, we start off, Maggid, with the opposite understanding of matzah, right? This is Ha Lahma Anya. This is the bread of oni, of affliction, of suffering, that our ancestors ate, that our ancestors ate in Egypt. So here is the tension laid out. In Rabban Gamliel's view, matzah is the thing that equals redemption. And in the introduction to Maggid, at least in the Babylonian Haggadot, matzah is the thing that we ate in Mitzrayim. Now, this tension was already noticed by some of the folks who are fiddling a little bit with Ha Lahma Anya. We have some manuscripts of Haggadot that have Ha Lahma Anya with a little bit of an addition. So instead of Ha Lahma Anya diachalu avatana be'arad de Mitzrayim, that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt, we have Ha Lahma Anya diachalu avatana dinafku, or b'mafkahon me'arad de Mitzrayim. This is the bread that they ate when they went out of the land of Egypt. And that would make a lot of sense. And in some ways, that's the expanded version of Rabban Gamliel that we have in our Haggadot, where the fact that matzah didn't rise is representative of the geula, because we were hurrying on our way out. And therefore, when I look at matzah, I remember that it didn't have time to rise, not because I was suffering, but rather because I was leaving. And therefore, it's on the geula side of the ledger. But you can see that this is sort of a correction to the tension. It's sort of a resolution of the tension that Ha Lahma Anya in its original state brings us, which is, no, this wasn't the bread that we ate when we left. This was our diet when we were in Egypt. And this is a representation of our suffering. This is the lechem oni, the bread of suffering. One other thing just to note about Ha Lahma Anya is that not all Haggadot had that first line. For instance, in Siddur Rav Sadia Gaon, who's not in term of the 9th, 10th century, we learned there that he only has what we have as the second and third lines of Ha Lahma Anya. He actually has them flipped. he has this year we are here, next year in Israel. This year we are slaves. Next year will be B'nai Chorin or B'nai Chari, as he has in his Haggadah. And he has the invitation for everybody to come and eat, but he actually doesn't have the Ha Lahma Anya. So that's another way of resolving the tension, is just not to have the line of this is the bread of affliction. But as we're going to see, the bread of affliction, lechem oni, is something that already appears in the Torah. So we're going to have to figure out, is matzah poor man's bread, as it were, or is matzah the symbol of redemption? Okay, so let's take a look at what we have here. Now, again, we noticed that the other symbols at the Seder, the Pesach and the Maror, have word plays with them. The Pesach lamb is because God passed over, and the Maror is al shem shem meraru, because the Egyptians embittered our lives. And wouldn't it have been nice if there was a word play on matzah, where we have this pasuk here, ushmartem et hamatzot, ki ba'etzem hayom hazeh hotzeti, right? Et tzivotechem me'eretz Mitzrayim. You shall observe the matzah, which already sounds like you should observe the mitzvot. And actually there is a midrash that rereads it as mitzvot, but it's, I think, meant to call our attention to the fact that it's matzot. You should guard the matzot, because why? Because on that very day, hotzeti, I took you out, and matzah and motzi and lotzi really sound like each other. We have it in the poem as well, in the Kadesh Orchat's poem, motzi matzah. It sounds nice when you get there, and wouldn't it have been nice if that was the wordplay that we have, but we don't have that wordplay, interestingly enough, even though it's sort of lying there right before us. We just have al shem shenigalu, because we were redeemed, or they were redeemed. That's what matzah is meant to mean. Okay, so if matzah is the symbol of redemption, then why do I think it's also the symbol of our suffering? Well, this comes from this other verse in Devarim, talking about the instructions of the Pesach sacrifice. You shall not eat anything leavened with it. For 7 days thereafter, you shall eat unleavened bread. How to deal with the word alav there is a little bit tricky, because you're only supposed to eat the sacrifice on the first day. But they call that matzot lechem oni. It's the bread of suffering, or the bread of poverty. Again, oni is modern Hebrew means poor. Also is the inui, the suffering. That's something that we associate with Yom Kippur. It's stuff in which you're limited and reduced, not a symbol of redemption. But then the verse goes on and says, because you departed from the land of Egypt hurriedly, ki b'chipazon, you left in a hurry, so that you remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt as long as you live. So it seems like here lechem oni is connected to b'chipazon yatzata. There's again that would-be play on words, matzot and yatzata. It's right there, but nobody does anything with it. Lechem oni might here in this verse be a poor bread, a reduced bread, because you were hurrying out of Egypt, right? So you could read this verse simply as just talking about the redemption, but of course, lechem oni might lead you to say, "Oh, this is bread of suffering. I was suffering when I was eating this bread. This bread represents suffering." Okay, how do we understand lechem oni, and how does it get us to redemption if it seems to indicate poverty or suffering? Okay, so first of all, we have a number of midrashim that are trying to understand lechem oni, and we'll look at a few of them right now. So one understanding of lechem oni is about the quality of the matzah itself, not about the experience of eating it as a poor person, but rather it's the nature, it's the poor nature of the actual food. What is lechem oni? Shelo yalush lo b'yayin v'lo b'shemen v'lo b'shar kol hamashkim. You can't knead into it anything that might puff it up, like wine or oil or any other fruit juice. It just has to be flour and water. We know this as the main understanding of how to make matzah. And this is the prohibition about matzah ashira, the enriched matzah, at least coming out here. Lechem oni is not about a suffering per se. It's about a description of the bread itself. So that's one way of solving it. If you want matzah to only represent redemption, how do you deal with the challenge of lechem oni as a term? Oh, lechem oni is just describing the ingredients. You can't make it with fruit juice. You got to make it only with water, and therefore it's reduced. It's impoverished, but only on an ingredient level, not on a symbolic level. So that might be one way that you could go. But we have some other ways that make it explicit that this is actually a bread of suffering. Rabbi Shimon says Lama nikra lechem oni. Why was it called lechem oni? El al shem inui shenitanu b'mitzrayim. It's because of the suffering that we were made to suffer in the land of Egypt. So at least according to Rabbi Shimon, the matzah, which is called lechem oni, is not a 100% redemption symbol. It is a symbol, rather, of the suffering in Egypt. And in some ways, we have a similar opinion from Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. He gets a little bit more roundabout to get there. But working on another verse in the same chapter, Rabbi Yossi HaGlili says, "You shall not eat anything leavened with it for 7 days thereafter. You shall eat unleavened bread." Sorry, that's our verse. Lo tochal alav chametz shivat yamim tochal matzot. Right? You should eat matzot for 7 days. So how am I supposed to understand that? Shomeani af ma'aser sheni. Is it possible that this would include even the second tithe? The second tithe, Maaser Sheni, was the tithe that you would bring to Jerusalem and eat as a part of a sort of festive celebration of the holidays. Could you have your matzah as part of your Maaser Sheni? And then, no, you can't. Why? Because it says that this matzah is lechem oni, and that excludes anything that is meant to be eaten in joy. So Maaser Sheni, the second tithe, is meant to be eaten in joy. Matzah must not be part of my Maaser Sheni because it says it's lechem oni, i.e. the opposite of joy. Now, if matzah was a bread of redemption, it should be eaten in joy. So there's sort of an implied problem here from Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, who says, your tithe is meant to be eaten in joy. Lechem oni is not eaten in joy. And therefore, this seems to be on the side of Rabbi Shimon, that this is a bread that represents suffering, okay? So you have on the one hand, maybe lechem oni is nothing about the experience of suffering in Egypt. It's just about the ingredients. On the other hand, we have a Tannaitic strand that does say that this is a bread of suffering and poverty. Okay. How do we deal with it in our Seder itself? Well, we have this other amazing drasha of Shmuel in the Bavli, lechem oni. It's not lechem oni, poverty or impoverished ingredients, but rather lechem she'onin alav dvarim. It's the oni is not poverty here, but it's rather a response, an answer, a note. And therefore, you're going to have the bread and then speak a lot about it. And we have a Braita that supports Shmuel's position as well, which might indicate, like, how can we whip out the bread, the matzah, way before we're about to eat it? We break that bread, yachatz, at the beginning of Maggid, basically to fulfill this understanding of it. Lechem she'onin alav darim, we're going to answer a lot of words around the matzah, means the matzah needs to be on the table as we tell the story. So this is like a creative understanding of lechem oni to move it away from the bread of poverty, Ha Lahma Anya, that we opened up Maggid with, but instead move it into the side of redemption. Oh, this isn't about poverty. This is about telling the story and answering questions and sort of doing the activity of Maggid. That's what matzah is, and therefore it could be sort of on the column that represents redemption. And we're gonna explore that a little bit further as we understand what yachatz, the breaking of the matzah, is trying to get at. Finally, this is sort of an interesting possibility of playing with the symbols. We have the Tosfot who say, even though afal gav dahavya lechem oni, even though it is poverty bread, poor people's bread, yesh lo ochla derech cherut, you should eat it in a manner that is a free person's way. That is to say, you're supposed to lean when you eat the matzah. And this, I think, is probably the most interesting and compelling understanding of matzah itself. It's not that it's either one or the other symbol. It's either the bread of poverty or the bread of redemption only, but rather through the course of the night, we sort of transform this symbol. It's like the liminal symbol. Maror is all bad and Pesach is all good. Matzah is that symbol that kind of moves from being the poor person's bread to being the bread of redemption. It starts off as the lechem oni, but it moves into the derech cherut. It's going to be that thing that maybe we did eat in Egypt, but then it's the thing that we also ate on the way out. And so it's the symbol that sort of takes us on the journey, perhaps, of moving from one side of the ledger to the other in terms of its understanding.